Piale soon brought together against them. On the 27th of September, Piale re-entered the harbour of Constantinople in triumph. He had previously sent a vessel to announce his victory, which appeared in the Golden Horn with the captured high standard of Spain trailing in the sea behind the stem. On the day of the arrival of Piale, Soliman went to the kiosk of his palace, at the water's edge of honor with his presence the triumphal procession of his captain Pasha. Don Alvaro and other Christian prisoners of high rank were placed conspicuous on the poop of the Ottoman admiral's galley, and the captured vessels were towed along rudderless and dismasted. Those who were near Sultan Suleiman observed that his aspect on this proud day of triumph bore the same grave and severely calm expression which was its usual characteristic. The ambassador of King Ferdinand, who was present, attributed this social composure to magnanimity, and admired the great head of that old sire, which received unmoved anything that fortune could bring. The modern German historian of House of Ottoman points out that this exulting austerity of the great Sultan may have been caused by the domestic affliction, which by this time he had sustained and which may have stilled while it saddened his heart. Favorite and a vizier whom a sultan begins to dread has not long to live. Ibrahim was married to Suleiman's sister, but not even this close affinity could save him. Ibrahim came to the palace of Constantinople on the 5th March 1536 to dine with the Sultan, as was his custom, and when on the next morning messengers from his home came to seek him, they found him strangled. The state of his body showed that he had struggled hard for life, and 100 years afterwards the traces of his blood on the place once were pointed out, fearful warnings of the lot that awaited those who sought to win their entrance there as royal favorites. Von Hammer gives a long list of other high officers whom Suleiman once honored and trusted, but whom he ultimately gave to the fatal bowstring. But this act of severity seemed slight compared with the death of the princes of his own race, who perished by his orders. Having been an only son, Suleiman was spared the guilt of fratricide on his accession to the throne, but he showed repeatedly in the course of his reign that when state necessity called for blood, the holiest feelings of humanity interposed in vain. His cousin, the descendant of the unfortunate Prince Jan, who came into his power when Rhodes was taken, was put to death with all his family by Suleiman's command, and there was still nearer and dearer blood upon his hands. While Suleiman was still young, a Russian girl in his harem, named Horem, was, which means the joyous one, had gained an almost unbounded influence over him by her beauty and lifelines, and such was the fascination of the manners, so attractive and soothing to the very spirit of reality were the animated graces of the conversation. Her skill was so subtle in reading the thoughts of her lord, and in selecting the most favorable times for the exercise of her power in guiding them, that she preserved her ascendancy in his affection long after they both had outlived the season of youth and until the day of her death. In 1558, she had persuaded Suleiman to enfranchise her, and to make her his wife, according to the Mohammedan ritual, and the honors paid by him to her memory proved the constancy and fervor of his passion even after death. Her domed mausoleum was raised by him close to the magnificent mosque, the Soleimaniye, which he had constructed and which he appointed as his own place of sepulture. The tomb of the Sultana Horem still attests the fatal fondness which the Russian beauty inspired in the greatest of the Turkish sultans, and which transferred the succession to the throne of Ottoman from the martial and accomplished hero to a ferocious but imbecile drunkard. Suleiman had a son, Prince Mustafa, born by him by a Circassian, who had been the favorite sultana before the Muscovite slave Hurrem enslaved her master. Hurrem also bore children to Suleiman, and all her address was employed to secure the succession to the throne for her son Prince Selim. As a necessary step towards that object, she sought the destruction of Prince Mustafa, who had the elder born, was regarded as the natural heir. A daughter of the Sultana Hurrem was married to Rostam Pasha, who, by her influence, was raised successively to the dignities of the Beylerbey of Diyarbakir and of second vizier, and finally to the highest station in the empire below the throne. To the office of Grand Vizier, Rostam Pasha employed all his power and influence as his mother-in-law directed him, and she thus acquired a ready and efficient instrument for the ruin of the devoted Mustafa. This unhappy prince was distinguished for personal grace and activity, and for high spirit and intelligence. In the various governments which were entrusted to him by Suleiman, as he advanced towards manhood, he gave proof of such abilities, both civil and military, that he was looked on as likely to surpass his father in glory and to become the most eminent of all the house of Ottoman. The malignant artifices of Hurrem and Rostam awakened in Suleiman's mind first jealousy and then dread of his overpopular and overpraised son. As Suleiman advanced in years, the posthumous whisperings of the stepmother grew more and more effective. The old Suleiman was studiously reminded how his own father Selim had dethroned Bayezid II, and the vision was kept before him of a renewal of that scene, of a young and vigorous prince, the favorite of the soldiery, seizing the reins of empire, and of an aged father retiring of demotica and deed. It was at last in 1553 when Suleiman was preparing for the second war with Persia that he was fully wrought up to the conviction that Prince Mustafa was plotting against him, and that it was necessary before he marched against the foreign enemy to crush the germs of treason at home. In the autumn of that year, Suleiman placed himself at the head of the troops which had been collected in Asia Minor and with which it was designed to invade Persia. The season was then too far advanced for such military operations, and the army was to winter at Aleppo and to open the campaign in the following spring. But Suleiman had been persuaded that it was not safe for him to tarry at Constantinople. He was told by his Grand Vizier that the soldiers in Asia Minor were murmuring and plotting among themselves in favor of Prime Mustafa, and that the prince encouraged their preparations for a military revolution against the old Padishah Suleiman. He repaired, therefore, to the army, and Hurrem's son Prince Selim, at his mother's instigation, sought and obtained the Suleiman's permission to accompany him. When the army reached Eregli, the ancient Archialis, Prince Mustafa arrived at head quarters, and his tents were pitched with great pomp of the vicinity of those of the Sultan. On the next day the viziers paid their visits to compliment to the prince and received presents of sumptuous robes of honor. On the following morning Prince Mustafa mounted a stately and richly caparisoned charger and was conducted by the viziers and emissaries. Amid the loud acclamations of the soldiers to the royal tent, where they dismounted in expectation of having an audience of his father. His attendants remained at the entrance of the tent. Prince Mustafa passed into the interior, but he found there not the Sultan, not any of the officers of the court, but the seven mutes of the well-known grim ministers of the blood orders of imperial manslayer. They sprang upon him and fastened the fatal bowstring round his throat, while he vainly called for Mary to his father, who was in an in an apartment of the tent. According to some accounts, Suleiman, impatient at the long continued struggle between the mute and his victim, looked in upon the horrible scene and with straightening arm and angry brow urged his executioners to complete the work of death. While the prince thus perished within the tent, his master of the horse and a favorite aga who had accompanied him to the entrance were cut down on the outside. The tidings of his execution soon spread throughout the camp, and the troops, especially the Janissaries, gathered together in tumultuous indignation and called for the punishment of Grand Vizier, to whose intrigues they imputed the death of their favorite prince. To appease their fury to obnoxious Rostam was deprived of his oven of office, and Ahmed Pasha, who had distinguished himself in Hungarian wars, wars was made Grand Vizier in his stead. But after his lapse of 2 years, the son-in-law of the all-powerful Sultana was restored to his former dignity, and Ahmed Pasha was put to the death on frivolous charges of misconduct and disloyalty. The great The tragedy of the death of Prince Bayezid, another son for whom Suleiman, at a later period of his reign, caused to the put of death, was attended with even more melancholy circumstances after the death of the Sultana Hürrem, but while her son-in-law, the Vizier Rostam, yet lived, a deadly rivalry arose between her two sons, Selim and Bayezid. The tutor of the Princess Lala Mustafa Pasha had originally favored Prince Bayezid, but finding that his prospects of promotion would be greater if he sided with Prince Selim, he made himself the unscrupulous partisan of the latter, and, by a series of the darkest intrigues, by suggesting false hopes and unreal dangers, by intercepting and suppressing some letters and procuring others of the written and read, he drove Bayezid into rebellion against his father, the result of which was the overthrow and death of the unhappy prince. Suleiman believed the Prince Bayezid was an unnatural son, toward whom his fatherly remonstrances and warnings had been vainly employed, and Bayezid was led by the art of the tutor of regard his father as a morose tyrant who rejected his child's filial submission and entreaties for pardon, and who was resolved to exercise again the same cruel severity which he had shown toward Prince Mustafa. Bayezid was far more popular with the soldiery and people than Prince Selim, whose drunken and dissolute habits had made him an object of general contempt, and whose unpopularity was increased by his personal resemblance to his hated mother, the Sultana Hürrem. Bayezid Bayezid's features and demeanor resembled those of his father. His habits of life were blameless. His intellectual powers of literary accomplishment were high, and his capacity for civil government and military command, though not equal to those of the lamented Mustafa, were such as to gain favor and command respect. Thus, over after his defeat at Konya, 8 May 1559, by his father's third vizier, Sokolli, a considerable force adhered to Prince Bayezid in his fallen fortunes and followed him into Persia, where he took refuge together with his four infant sons at the court of Shah Tahmasp. He was at first treated there with princely honors, and the Shah pledged a solemn oath never to give the royal refugee up to his father. But Suleiman sternly and imperatively required the extradition or the execution of the rebel and the rebel's children. Prince Selim also sent letters and messengers to Persia to procure the deaths of his brother and nephews, and he gave liberal quotations of misapplied verses of the Koran and copied passages from eminent writers to overcome the conscientious scruples of the Shah, who long hesitated at the treacherous breach of hospitality, and which he was urged commit fear at the last prevailed over Hana. Persia's cicatrice yet looked to raw and red after the Turkish sword, for the foragian process of the sultan to be disregarded, and the present death of Bayezid and his children was resolved on. Tahmasp thought that he evaded the obligation of his oath by giving up his guests, not to the immediate officers of Suleiman, but to emissaries sent specially by Selim to receive and slay them. It was the period of solemn fast which the Shii Mohammedans keep annually in memory of Hossein, when the Turkish princes were delivered up to the executioners. Such was the sympathy which their fate inspired among the Persians, that they interrupted their lamentations for the murdered son of Ali, to sorrow over the royal victims then perishing before them, and instead of the curses and the slayers of Hossein, which the Shiites are then accustomed to pour forth imprecations, resounded throughout Tabriz against the executioners of the innocent grandchildren of Suleiman. A short elegiac poem, written by Prince Bayezid a little before his death, is preserved in the work of Turkish historian Sorakzade, and proves to how great an extent that unhappy prince